Thank you, and good morning, everyone from Seattle. I'm an hour behind you, and probably with a few more clouds and rain. But beyond that, we share we share interest in this topic. So, in terms of my background in this particular information and kind of what has kept me focused all these years, is actually it's been 42 years, not since I've been teaching systematic instruction, but it was actually 42 years ago when I had my first job in the field. And it was actually in an institution, one of our state institutions here in Washington State. And not only did I work there, but I actually lived there. So all of a sudden, I was in this world and meeting people that I hadn't known existed. I was raised in a small town in the 50s here in Washington State. In my small town in the 50s growing up, I hadn't really seen people with what we now would say are intellectual developmental disabilities. They typically were picked up at the hospital and taken to institutions. So imagine my surprise when all of a sudden I walk into this place of living, if you will, where there are close to 2,000 people, again, who we would now say have intellectual or developmental disabilities. So that was how I entered the field. Looking back on that time, I would have to say that while I learned a great deal and I value that experience in terms of my learning, I really don't know that I was able to help much or do much. It was a time when, for the most part, there were very low expectations that people were capable of learning or changing. And there was very little known about if someone didn't appear to be able to learn how could we engage them and how could we teach. So starting 42 years ago, in leaving that setting, I went probably about 39 years ago and worked in a couple of the largest, what we would now, in our state anyway, we referred to them as sheltered workshops. Starting in about 39 years ago, one was called Northwest Center for the Retarded, which wouldn't be, it's not called that today. It actually evolved and is now offering services in the community. The other was a very large facility-based program called the United Cerebral Palsy Center. So spent time in workshops, stayed connected to the people and stayed trying to learn. And it was probably soon after that I was introduced to systematic instruction. And for me, that was a real awakening because for the first time, I felt like I had a way of being able to offer support and help that was meaningful. So that has remained my passion, and I feel really honored to be able to continue contributing in that way. I now am pretty much full-time consulting and training in the field of supported employment, but I've been able to sort of learn about services and grow with services as they've been available, starting in the community about 1985 when we began able to use funds to do support for people in community settings. So that's kind of my background, my passion with the information. And I also like to give people a sense that both in terms of where some of you may have been, in that all across the country, people are needing to kind of step up to skill sets and consider supporting people in settings where they haven't had access to before. So I've been through that transition process. So the first hand raise, and I only have a couple of them, but I'm kind of interested in knowing, and it looks like we have about 43 people signed on right now. So of those of you who are listening, how many of you have had access to formal training in systematic instruction? So I'm going to let Corbin kind of keep track of that, and I will go ahead and continue talking. Okay, so if you'll keep an eye on that, Corbin, I'm gonna move ahead. It really doesn't change the information that I'm sharing with you, but it's just kind of helpful for me to know. And I continue as a learner, anytime I hear about someone talking about this content, I go listen because I feel like there's always learning I can do and expanding my my understanding and skill set. So it's like we're up to about maybe 6 out of 45, which is, again, content doesn't change at this level. So I'm going to talk now just a little bit for those of you for whom it is new information, and a review for those who've had training. This is kind of that elevator speech on 30 seconds. Tell me what's systematic instruction. Let's see if I can. If you can close that hand raise box, Corbin, and if you can't, that's fine. There we go. Okay, thanks. So it says universally effective approach. And historically, even though this skill set was established and research related to people who had difficulty in learning, this approach to instruction is effective when any learner is having trouble learning tasks or activities. So those of you who have raised kids or involved with kids, systematic instruction can work. It works really effectively. If you're coaching sports, you know, even though you might not be calling that, you're using systematic instruction. If you're sharing a hobby with someone, if you're maybe teaching your coworkers to do something, taking this approach can be effective with all learners. So that's, for me, that's an important thing to share so that people don't think this is a separate set of skills that they have to know about or learn. In many cases, people have been using systematic instruction, and this is an opportunity to sort of go a little bit deeper and also be challenged a little bit in that when folks aren't learning, what do we really need to focus on in terms of that skill set? So it's about getting ready to teach. And what I'll be talking about today, a lot of discussion around task design and task analysis. And it's also then, once we have that knowledge, it's about individualizing teaching strategies. So you have a general understanding of some choices you might make, but what do we need to think about when we're working with specific learners? So really individualizing that information. And the other piece of it is that it's about assessing progress in a tangible way, so that we actually have data and can make some database decisions. So, and it came about because there was once a time, it was once widely accepted, and it was very devastating, this belief that diagnostic labels or people's IQ scores predicted an individual's ability to learn. So on this slide, there's definitely some disrespectful language, but it's historical language. It's language of a period of a time that had a significant impact for a number of years about whether people even got an opportunity to learn. This quote in 1866, Edward Seguin was considered by many to be the father of the United States movement toward institutionalization. So here's just a quote, and again, devastating language. Only a medical man could fully appreciate the educational needs of idiots while also providing the necessary diagnostic tools, which I'm not sure what those would have been in 1866. But by doing that, they could then separate the idiot who was amenable to training from the idiot encumbered by other disabilities who was not. Unfortunately, there was a period of time when that was kind of the prevailing thinking. So what grew out of that was, just to go on a little bit more, that lack of expectation was often even reflected in the naming of services. And this could be a long, long list. And if you go back to each of your states, you probably could come up with those early names of services. But in 1906, they opened up the Rome State Custodial Asylum for Unteachable Idiots. And people oftentimes say, you're kidding. That was the actual name of the institution. And yes, it was. So you think about lack of expectation and lack of future and lack of opportunity for people entering that particular living situation. 1917, the Faribault School for the Training of Imbeciles in the Custody of Idiots. And again, you know, very unfortunate language and labeling. Another thing to realize, for those of you who don't, is that this actually was historical in terms of tied to IQ scores in the diagnostic manuals and journals. When you, once they had the ability to sort of assign different IQ scores, they needed to put some kind of general language describing that. So, which we're unfortunately still having to deal with that language today. It also was reflected when special education became an opportunity. When federally they said that all children are entitled to an education. One of the things that happened in when special education services were designed was this belief that there needed to be some way of serving kids based on their label or expectation. So there's initials there that may be familiar to some, but not all. The tracks were for kids who were labeled as TMR, EMR, and custodial. And TMR was referencing kids who were considered to be trainable, mentally retarded. EMR, educable, mentally retarded. And then custodial, meaning there's going to be some kids who just won't benefit from expectation, and therefore we will be custodians. We will just take care of. So well-intended beliefs that once we identify ability, then we can kind of segment, but unfortunate decisions that sometimes predicted kids' future. Even in special education, I know in my state, and there are differences in states, I'm still seeing a division in transition age kids where there's a certain group of kids who are considered on track for transition, and there seem to be some other programs for the kids. Sometimes they're referred to as life skills. That's true in my state. So that, there's going to be some kids on this track to employment and ready to go, and there's other kids who are not yet ready, which, again, an unfortunate grouping. So this, again, a little bit more history, and then we'll jump into design. But I think for those of you who don't know the history, I think it's helpful to know. I think if we don't know it, we're in danger of repeating it. And so here's some information that I pulled from Mark Gold, and I'll reference him a little bit later as well. He's definitely one of the pioneers in our field. So in one of the articles that he wrote in 1972, he talked about our sheltered workshop movement resulting in three main types of workshops. He labeled one as a transitional shop, people coming in from a variety of settings and they're going to get ready to go to work. He had another label, and I have to say, until I read this article, I hadn't heard of this particular label, but he called them extended care or terminal shops. And having worked in the system at a time when I believed we were doing the very best thing we could be doing, I actually worked in two different shops that would have been considered terminal, or maybe comprehensive in the sense that there were a few people that moved ahead, but in the most case, the belief was people's support needs and their readiness levels indicated they were going to just need to be here. So I mentioned the readiness model, and this is, again, history, but it's sort of a visual way of looking at kind of what were some of the catalysts to really continue focusing on this systematic instruction in terms of recognizing people's abilities. So this was actually a visual graphic that was set up based on some research done back in the 1980s. And these were all folks at the University of Oregon in the Research and Training Center. So what they did was they looked across the country, really, because in the 1980s, all states really had some form of facility-based program for people. And at that time, there was language about these being readiness programs or flow-through models. And so I'll just get my pointer here. So what we have in most states, and the names might have been a little bit different, but services were organized so that there was sort of an entry program or a type of service that might have been labeled a day hab center or adult day program. But that was kind of one box of service, if you will. And those people, there might have been some movement then into this other type of service. Some states call this pre-vocational or work activity. And in that was really a place of readiness. You're going to get ready with your social skills and your eye contact and your productivity, your adult daily living skills. You're going to get all sorts of ready so that you can move into this other type of service, which typically was where people had more access to contract work and opportunities to earn a certain amount of money. And again, keep developing those skills and productivity levels so that you could move on into the competitive job. A couple things about this. Back at that period of time, the competitive job, in order to get into this box, the only resources available to you were going to be voc rehab, which were valuable resources and still are, but there was no such thing as blended funding or long-term support, or you had to be able to survive on the typical job development and work experience. And at a certain point, a successful closure was going to mean that you no longer had access to support, which did work for some people and work for some people today. But what you see from the graphic is if you look at the movement in any one year, the average number of people moving, it tends to be very small. Any 1 year movement into the next program. And then if you look at the average weight in any of the boxes, assuming someone was coming in down here and as a young person, young adult, waiting, down here you'd be coming out at about 77 if you were able to actually get through all the boxes. So kind of questions, and it was a great research project showing that actually people aren't flowing through this model, and that working with people and assuming some level of readiness is necessary to go to the next step was also not working for people. So here are the pioneers that I like to recognize because it was their work that really laid the way for high expectations and community inclusion in many ways. So you see a picture here, that's Mark Gold. He was at the University of Illinois. He actually started his work in about 1967. And his work actually is patented, and it's called the Try Another Way method. Some of you who've had some exposure to systematic instruction may have received training through some of his associates in Try Another Way. Paul Wayman was at the Virginia Commonwealth. He's still there now, actually, and he was doing, and his colleagues were doing research on systematic instruction. And Lou Brown, University of Wisconsin, that was a training college for special educators, and so he was talking about the need for these skill sets around systematic instruction. And Tom Bellamy, University of Oregon Specialized Training Program. And that was really, although I was fortunate enough to be able to learn from all of these individuals, it was at the University of Oregon, in their specialized training program that I really had a chance to be immersed in the technology and recognizing its value. So I want to make, I don't know if this is going to show up or not, actually, a little bit. So this was my textbook back in 1980 or so at the University of Oregon. And I don't know if you'll be able to read the title or not, but it's Vocational Habilitation of Severely Retarded Adults. The language would be very different right now. This was the language of the time. And that's another point I wanted to make, is that all of these individuals, they were really looking at folks who had been excluded from opportunity based on their label. And so they were looking at people who were carrying labels of the time of severe to profound mental retardation. So that was kind of the target audience or the focus group at that period of time. Those individuals shared fundamental beliefs, shared values. And as I read through these, the people that I work with now, the folks like you and the other people that I'm involved in working with around systematic instruction, I believe we all hold these same beliefs. The individuals previously labeled unable to learn had much more potential than anyone realized. How many times does that happen to you where you get a file or you get some information on someone and you sometimes are required to actually look at the file and read the file, and then you meet the actual person and you think, it doesn't match. This person doesn't match their diagnostic label. It doesn't match a lot of the behaviors I'm said to expect. It doesn't match. So I believe that, we all oftentimes believe this person is so capable. has more potential than anyone realizes. Um, the next one, all people with disabilities should have the opportunity to live their lives much like everyone else. That's what drives us now. But when I think back, and I wasn't actually working in the field in 1967, but Mark Gold, he was preaching this or sharing this with all of his audiences, and it was considered radical. There were some states who really didn't want him to come in and share this message. They believed they had the answer, and someone coming in and suggesting that folks have every right to be with us in the community and work with us in the community, that was not a popular belief. Everyone can learn if we can figure out how to teach them. I believe that everyone can learn. Have I been successful in bringing everyone to a level of independence that I'd hoped they might have or they might want? Not always, but I believe people can learn. And if they can't, I put that on me and not on their diagnosis or their inability in some way. So another person from the past, but his work speaks for itself. In order to do that, we really have to presume competence. We have to assume that someone has an intellectual ability and then provide opportunities to be exposed to learning. We have to presume someone wants to learn and assert himself or herself in the world. So what I'm going to have Corbin do is he's going to bring a video up now. But what I know now over the years is that it's an approach to task design, task analysis that allows us to think about tasks or jobs that might have been perceived as too complex or technical. Okay, that is, there can be a tendency when you have a chance to do a job analysis and get in and walk through an employment site. There may be a tendency to look for tasks or jobs that someone currently has the skill sets to do. And in that sense, it would be a match. Rather than to think about if I have the teaching technology and a high expectation, what might be some other tasks that I would consider? So that I find has been very true with my experience. So here's a visual example of that. This was in a Department of Licensing where I was doing an analysis. And this is a job that might match many people, disabilities or not, really well if you like consistency and patterns and same way every time, really clear cues. So this was one of the potential jobs I was looking at. But this was another job that they had me, well, they just mentioned, we were sort of walking through a hallway and the department manager said, and if you've got someone could do this job, that would be great. And I was walking through, my first kind of in my head voice was saying, oh, I don't think so. I'm just going to keep walking. But then I stopped myself, came back, and I said, okay, so tell me about this machine. What does it do? How does it work? I'd never seen it. It looked really complex and complicated. But you know what? When you broke it down, it really wasn't. And there were many really clear cues on how to operate. So cue driven, you take a piece of paper and you input into this little memory thing here. You load paper and envelopes. This stuffs envelopes and prepares for mailing. So the next step is you do this over here, and then you come and you check this over here. You load that, you check, and then when you're ready, you push the button and it starts. Okay. So when she said that, it's like, you know what? Let's put that on the list because I believe that there's many people that would be able to learn to do this. We'll talk about risk later, but one of the things she said was that this is a really sensitive machine, and it easily gets broken. And I said, what happens then? And she said, well, the whole department shuts down if it gets broken. And I said, well, does that happen? And she said, yeah, once or twice a month. And I said, well, who breaks it? And she said, well, just people. They just do it wrong or whatever. And I thought, well, okay, so I know what the standard is. I know it's possible. There's risk involved. It's possible that a supported employee might break it. But other folks on the floor are breaking it now. So let me train to that risk. And I can document when I believe someone is safely using the machine. And it just sort of allows you to have that conversation. So just in closing the importance of all of this content, it really does, it is a skill set that we're going to need if we're going to move forward with employment first. Capacity is highlighted here. What I see in the field is that when we are unable to teach to a certain level of independence, when we are unable to fade, it creates capacity issues across the board. Capacity in that individual isn't going to be able to add any hours because they're not going to be able to work unless we're there. Capacity in the sense that we can't begin working with the next person until we have someone who is safely and independently on the job. So we have to consider that. Another piece that I'll be speaking this week and next week is on this increasing independence through fading throughout a task rather than at the end. If we wait until the end of a task to start fading from an individual, we very likely already built in a certain amount of cue dependence that we're going to have a lot of difficulty fading out. And maybe harsh language, but I say down here that I really believe that this is a weapon to weaken the virtual readiness model. And what I mean by that is I know in our state and many states, the facility-based programs are either downsizing or they're completely closing. What we also know is that not all of those individuals are transitioning easily into jobs. And some of them are now waiting, but they're not waiting in a building, they're waiting at home. And so because they're not ready, they don't have the skill sets, they don't have the behavior set. So we still, I think out there is there's a virtual readiness model, that this is one of the skill sets that's going to help the breakthrough. Some of you've been in your jobs for a while, you're already doing teaching. And for some individuals you support, it's working. That I think of that oftentimes as loose teaching, casual learning. It's working. It's getting the person where they want or need to be. When it's not, then it's time to think about a more systematic approach to teaching. It's also incredibly helpful when someone's learning style is best accommodated by systematic instruction. And Stuart with the binding post is an example of that. He learns patterns very quickly. And if you're not ready to teach and haven't thought about that learning style, it's going to take him longer to learn, and therefore it's going to take you longer to teach. And another time systematic instruction is absolutely needed is when the activity or task has an element of risk. And we all know that there's the obvious risk of someone getting hurt in doing their job. Looking at some of these visual examples, some of you maybe have taught these tasks or in these settings. There's also, that a product could be damaged by doing it wrong. But then there's another risk if someone isn't doing their job safely or accurately, and that is that they lose their job. So there's different types of risk, and systematic instruction is one of the pieces to address that. So again, today, more focus on task design, task analysis. Next Tuesday on the teaching strategies. The task design, it's really about thinking what's going to be the best way for this individual to complete this task. But the best way or the most appropriate way is going to depend on a couple different factors. One may be the current design. Has that work been standardized in some way already? And some of you may sometimes bump into this situation where you go into, especially a chain situation or a large employer, and they will oftentimes already have gone in and decided what are the tasks involved in this particular position, what are the standards for accuracy and productivity. So it's important to recognize that may have been established with some employers, and we certainly want to know what those are. It may give us an opportunity to customize within that. It may not. But there are other employers where, for whatever reason, that they haven't gone through that process. They may be a smaller employer. They may be an employer that doesn't have the time or hasn't taken the time to really look at their work and how it's designed and so on. Another time we would think about changes to it would be to accommodate physical ease and efficiency, and it's kind of based on what we know about this person and their movement, their best learning style. What do we know about that we could be thinking about in terms of designing or redesigning this position? And that would include things that we might put in place even before the person starts that would be helpful. The task lists, the picture cards, building in cues. So task design gives us a chance to think about that before the person starts. What I realize is that folks are at all different levels of perhaps even receiving this information. Some of you may be job developers and you're kind of that's what you do. Some of you may be job coaches and you take the job once it's been handed off. Some of you may kind of do a little bit of both, where you design, you develop, and teach the job. So what I do know is that if there isn't a way of communicating this information and having whoever's on the ground on day one having this information, that it really puts that person, that job coach, employment specialist, at a huge disadvantage. So someone having this knowledge, best practice would be that the person who has developed now is also analyzing and then is teaching. But there are some organizations, I shouldn't say best practice, I would say that's an effective strategy. There are some organizations who are designed a little bit differently. But whoever is doing it, it's just important that this information gets communicated. What are the expectations for accuracy and productivity? Because you're going to want to know those from day one so that you can include that in your teaching. When you have to go back and reach those levels after a person has been in training for a while, after they've been doing a job for a while, it can really make it very difficult. So task design is a chance to learn about the cues in the job, the things that you're going to teach to. And one of the ways that I think about that in terms of natural cues is when you are in a situation where you're on your own, but there's something that you have to do. You have to learn to operate a piece of equipment, or you have to learn to use a certain appliance at home, or you have to navigate a building or a space independently, and there's no one there, there's no job coach or coworker to help you. What do? You know, how do you figure that out? Well, you begin searching for the cues that will tell you how to do it, right? The clues about what step is next. You try to figure it out, and sometimes that works, and sometimes you have to go find someone, or you have to go to YouTube, or you have to ask questions to be able to know, like, it's not clear to me, what should I be doing next? We have to be prepared to teach to those from the beginning, or we run the risk of becoming the cue. I mentioned that earlier. Unfortunately, and it's not just with disability, but it's that oftentimes when we are over supported, when someone is providing sometimes more assistance than we actually need, we become dependent on that. And we realize that when they're not there to show us where to turn when we're driving or how to fix a piece of equipment, we have to go back and get them. And then same is true for the learners that we work with. We have to be very cautious of giving information for learning versus at what point do we start fading back to see if that cue is resonating. So just for those of you who get music mindworms sometimes, I oftentimes think about that song, It's All About the Bass. So much of learning and being independent is actually all about the cue. So you could even put that the little music in your head. So a couple of slides just on putting your eyes on and kind of training your eye to look for cues and look for reasons why people might not be learning or inefficiencies. This is one of, and by the way, I've got hundreds of these slides. You'll probably be happy to know I'm not going to share all of them. But what I encourage people to do is when you're in with your professional hat on, or you're out and moving around in the world and you come to a situation where it's like really fascinating the way cues have been added, or maybe it's really frustrating because you can't see the cues, snap pictures. And I use those for reminders for myself. I use them when I'm working training staff. So this one had all kinds of information around it. I was traveling, and this particular airline, and this was a couple of years ago, but they had switched to supposedly a customer service where you get to tag your own bags. I'm not sure that was a customer service. I think it was an efficiency for them. But I was coming up the elevator one day and thought that there had been a security breach, something horrible had happened. There was this crowd of people around ticketing. And then I was looking further, and everybody seemed to be looking down at their suitcase, and they had these pieces of paper in their hand and looking back at their suitcase. And so this was something brand new. And you were supposed to look at this, and there's written instruction. You're supposed to, look at the two targets there and peel something off, but don't throw it away. Keep that, and then fold them together and tie it onto your suitcase. And then you're supposed to take it down and put it somewhere. So some of you may have now experienced that and you're used to it and it's no big deal, but I'll tell you what, that was something new. And on that day, it was chaos. And people were anxious. They didn't know what they should be doing. There was one person to help about 50 to 75 people. So one of the things I thought of right away, once I understood what was happening, was, oh my gosh, they could hire a lobby attendant, if you will. How many of you have folks that would figure that out right away? They would know how to look for, confusion, what looks like confusion. They would come, they would offer their help, they would show someone how to tag their bag, get it off to the next area. So that was an inefficiency that was happening with an employer that I thought, actually, there could be a solution for that. Also, this one was kind of puzzling. I'm always really curious about my environment. And this was in a hotel setting where they had actual glass drinking glasses, which value added, I like that as a customer. But every single glass in this 22-story hotel with all these rooms had cellophane over it, which I understand probably why, to show that it has not been used, I guess. But I thought about it and I thought, number one, that I'm not sure how much I care about that. And number two, I wonder who put all of that cellophane on all of those glasses. I'm pretty sure there's not a machine that does that. I was curious about that. And then the next morning when I go to get my coffee, I see that the ceramic mugs, which I value, also have cellophane. And now they've got this orange dot, which I hadn't had coffee yet. So I was kind of thinking, so what's that for? Well, it's always interesting if we have the time to chat about that. But what I figured out, and most of you probably realized, is that this is a visual cue so that those of us who haven't had our coffee yet or don't have our glasses on don't pour coffee into a mug that has cellophane on it. And again, it's like, so I wonder who does that and puts the dot on. So stay curious about things like that. Another situation, this was real life. For the life of me, I could not get in and out of this swimming pool because it had a safety mechanism that was supposed to error-proof getting in and out. And so I would, pull hard, nothing was happening. In the same way, pushing, nothing was happening. But then what I discovered was that what they hadn't made clear was that it was a simultaneous manipulation. You actually had to pull up on you had to pull up on this, you had to pull up on this in order to get in or out. So it's like, that's a cue that if people don't understand that, they could be kind of frustrated, except the 8 to 10-year-olds who knew exactly what to do. And actually, they were the ones that showed me. Just another example of cues that if you understand them, you get what you need. If you don't, you have failure and you think maybe it's broken. So this was just a juice dispenser, and what I saw was that there's all kinds of color cues and written cues and action cues. You're supposed to push, and so when I tried to get my juice, I would push and nothing would come out. And I kind of retraced everything and I pushed again, nothing came out. So I thought, well, maybe I don't need that juice. I'll come over here and I'll try this juice. And I pushed and nothing came out. When I looked closer, what I discovered was that these push areas, they look like cues. They look like buttons, but they're actually just an indicator of where to put the glass. What's happened is so many people pushed there that it wore the foil off. Okay. So again, and I watched other people come through. I just sat back and kind of took my data, and I was not the only one that had a problem. Adding, fixtures so that with all of, there's so many buttons and options here. It's like most people don't even deal with all of those. They just really need red settings, or maybe you could add red and blue settings. So examples, and I'm sure many of you end up using these strategies with the people that you support. So it also can be about understanding what is it about the job that's physically demanding or that could present an issue for a learner. So the fine motor, difficult manipulations, what do I need to understand about that? What might I add to make a task easier to remember? Is there an opportunity to design it so that I can minimize errors? So all of these are things that I think about when I'm going through task design. And this particular slide is interesting because it was a great job for this individual. It was a perfect match for this individual. But physically, she had a hard time doing it. It was sterilizing all the equipment in a children's therapy center. And she totally knew it. She knew it was important. She understood the routine, but she physically was having fatigue in just doing all of the wiping down and holding on to things. So we did some troubleshooting and together came up with maybe some alternatives. You see them there to try out so that it would make it a little physically easier for her to do. The checklist that we could add in ahead of time. This is just one that I like a lot. It's really simple, an app called First Then, and it allows you, it does need a phone, but it's very low tech after that, a phone or a device, a viewing device. So, and back before that time, many of you probably were of the very low tech variety because we had no places where we cut out pictures and laminated them. That still works for some people just great. Sometimes minimizing the cues is what we do in our job. And I'm actually at a point of time when, with 5 different remotes for one TV set, I'm just about getting ready to tape everything. Something that I keep in mind about task design is that I should have some skills around that. It's what we should know about. But one of the factors that I always consider is, how does this work for this individual? I think I know what might work, but I need to really watch to see, is this working for the individual? So one of the ways I talk about that is the whole cereal and milk, in that I have a way that I prefer to get milk and cereal together. Most people do. But actually, you could do it the reverse way, and it would still be cereal and milk. And boy, you want to start an argument at a party just to ask people which is the right or wrong way to do this. Apparently, according to the person who invented the toilet paper wheel, there is a right way. But I know many of us might argue with that and have our own stories. But the bottom line is, whether you do it this way or the other way, the question I always ask is accuracy and productivity going to be about the same? Then I'm not going to fight someone on their preference. I would rather go with the movement and the pattern that works for them. So moving into task analysis and a little bit of information around that, given that this is an overview. So we're going to be stepping through a little bit quick. So referencing the fact that I think there were 6 or 7 people that said they'd had formal training in systematic instruction, I'm guessing that that's probably true in the area of task analysis as well. So I want to do just a little bit of an overview of what, when, and why, recognizing that initially in our field, and when I say our, I'm referencing kind of the collective our, but when I was taught back in the 1979-80 to use task analysis, that was a fairly new tool in our field back then, and it was one of the first really tangible tools that we had. It's like, wow, we've got this marvelous thing called a task analysis. What ended up happening that I experienced was kind of this pendulum swing that went way over here and said, if task analysis is a good thing and evidence-based and we should be using it, then by golly, we're going to have one for every person in every situation, in every activity. And it kind of even got to the point of saying whether they need one or not, we're just going to have them for everybody, which very quickly led to people believing that there wasn't a value in them and that there was a lot of excessive work. And I would have to say that applied in that way, that was really true. There were many people who did not need a task analysis for something they were going to be learning. There were other people who needed one, but because we used to make one task analysis for everybody in the workshop. We had 125 that might not work for 120 people of the people because it wasn't individualized enough. So it's breaking the task down, doing it. I do it following a job analysis after I have a sense of what are the individual tasks within this job, and also what is the response to individual need. In other words, I have a sense of where the gaps are going to be and the skill sets that this person is maybe going to have to work on, but I'm not going to write out a bunch of task analyses until I've been on the job and supporting someone and kind of figuring out where may I need one and how detailed does it need to be. Only a useful tool when the complexity of the task is presenting challenges to the learner or to the trainer. And that is the complexity of the task may be one such as that big machine that I showed you, or it may be one that some of you may have been run into when someone truly needs to tie off a bag tightly and doesn't know how to tie off a bag. That can seem like something that should be such an easy thing to learn, and yet if someone really doesn't know, it can become a number of steps, and the trainer might need to get their head around really how many steps are there, because when I tie off a bag, it seems like one. So in doing that, it really focuses the trainer attention on the specific demands of the task and the cues within the task. So some guidelines in making one individually, it's individualized in my world, specific to the individual, the task, and the trainer. Prior to writing, I'm going to be practicing it with a learner, including any change to the task design. So if I'm putting in a fixture or a checklist or whatever that I want to be a part of that task, I'm going to want to include that in the task analysis. So I'm tracking to see if they do those in between steps of getting the tool or adjusting the tool, that sort of thing. Once I think I have a pretty good idea about that, then I'm going to break it down into steps and list them in order, including the cue for each step. And even for those of you who've done task analysis, this may be a little different approach, and I will explain that you can write a task analysis with only the steps of the task analysis, and it is still a task analysis. Nobody would question that. It would meet everybody's standards for it being a task analysis. I learned, and the reason for learning it in a certain way, which was to list the cue first, is that if you get in the practice of listing the cue for a step, you're more likely to teach to the cue and not become the cue. So that's my rationale. I'm going to show you some examples of the task analysis form where the cue is listed as well. And then when you're ready, you write that all in a clear and concise manner. So keep in mind that a task analysis just lists the steps. It doesn't teach the steps. It lists the steps that you're going to teach. It doesn't say how you're going to teach the steps. So that's one thing that I see when I'm working, have a chance to actually work with people in writing them, is that sometimes people get hung up on, but what if they don't understand this verbal cue, or what if they don't understand this or that? And so they're kind of trying to think about, how am I going to teach that step? This just lists the step. It doesn't teach it. Okay, so this is the task that Stuart was working on. I'll give you a reference to that. And so this is what the task analysis might look like for someone learning that job. In Stuart's case, I have to say, he learned that job so quickly that I could just document that we spent this much time and he's producing it accurately. So I could document that. But this gives you a chance to just kind of look at what that might look like on a form. And so what you see is, it's not letting me draw the cursor down for some reason. Maybe if I put this here and then do that. Oh, okay, well, I'll have to just talk you through it. So what you see on the left side is the cues. What you see on the right side is the steps. And so the cue for getting started is that the supplies are ready. Step, pick up the base. When he's done that accurately, the base is in your hand. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay. You see the cue there. Now he's going to orient the base. He's got the shiny end up. Now he's going to pick up the base, pick up the post, excuse me. So what you see is the cues lifted on the left. The actual steps are on the right. This form also has, and this is, I will give you the template for this form. I think you have it already. There's nothing about it. But in terms of then taking data on how someone is doing on this task, I asked if you had a chance to print this out ahead, because I want you to keep looking at the form if you've got it, and then look at these data collection guidelines. In using this form, I collect data only on a probe or intermittent basis, just a sampling over time. You do not have to take data every time someone goes through a task. It's more than you need, and you won't be able to focus on the teaching if you're doing that. You just need a sampling over time. When I'm taking data, if someone has difficulty, I'm going to assist and correct during the data probe. They won't get credit for that step, but I'm going to give the input, the feedback they need to get it done correctly. I don't want someone to go through an entire task or unit without any correction if they're doing it wrong. So I'm going to interrupt and assist. I'll talk about those how you correct next week in the webinar. If someone, if I give assistance or they make an error, I'm going to record a minus. If they do it without any help or assistance, I'm going to record a plus. So if we look back to that form, and if you have printed one out individually and look at this first column, okay, so that was my first data probe on that day. 15 steps, and if you count up how many steps did he do accurately and independently. So if you're taking the time to do that, you can count out how many accurately and independently, and then you go to that particular box and you place the dot in that box, your first data point. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to go up to the 8, and we're going to put a data point there. Did I count that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right. And the next, you come over the next data probe you go through, you count how many pluses there, and so on. So what you end up with, and we just did a couple data points there, is you see a skill acquisition. Like, well, when he started doing this job, he was here. He had 7 out of 15 correct. And after a day of several different training sessions, now he's got 15 out of 15 correct. So that is an explanation of the form, knowing that I'm sure many people have questions. And we'll try to. A few more just examples of the way you can use a task analysis. So that was on a product, that labeler, and the binding post was on a binding post. And here would be an example of how you could throw someone's major tasks in a job into a similar form, and you could get an overview of generally their level of independence and accuracy in the entire task, if you will. So you see some pretty big steps here: checking water coolers, gathering magazines, making coffee, filling air pot. Those are, each one of those, actually, it could involve a number of different steps. But as you're working with someone and you're providing the support and you're teaching, you may see that they're gradually, without a lot more breakdown of the task, they are getting the task. That allows you then to look at, so where are they not making progress? So here's the progress they're making, but there's a really clear indication here of where they're not getting all the steps. So that would be an opportunity where you could pull that step out and really think about it. How many steps are involved in refilling that, putting that cartridge in? On this particular cartridge that I was working with, that one step turned into 20 steps, right? So you can kind of drill down and really focus on the areas that the person's having, the biggest struggles with, whether that is the fine motor or remembering how to do it, or, some of the decisions that have to be made along the line. But that would be an example of how you can get further detail on a step that someone's not getting. So I believe passionately there's a time and place for task analysis. I think it's a skill set that we should know how to use it and when to use it. It gives us efficient, it's an efficient method to collect that data. How are they doing on the skill? What's their productivity level? Are they safe on this job? It's really sensitive to small gains, so that if someone even gains one step from one work day to the next, they've picked up another step or two, it will show up and it can be celebrated. In the same way, if someone is not making progress over time on a task or pieces within a task, it's time to kind of look at that and say, so what are our training decisions? Sometimes it's data that can be shared with a number of people where you together decide, are we going to try to negotiate that task out? Is this a task that we're not making enough progress on in terms of independence and accuracy? We might want to think about the job match. So it's actually data that can be interpreted and shared with others. This final slide, and then I think we end up with maybe just a couple minutes for questions. But the task analysis itself, where employers will use a tool to be able to demonstrate if someone is safely, accurately, productively doing their job, it's a tool that's been around a long time. We started looking at it as a field in the late 60s. Industry has been using it since the early 1900s, breaking something down into the steps that need to be completed, and then documenting whether or not an employee is getting a step or needs training on a task. This particular picture I snapped at the blood bank, where the process of intake was divided into, detailed into these steps, and then the person learning to do intake basically was audited by the trainer. This guy happened to be the trainer that day, and I was actually the actual patient. And he was watching the woman who had been trained to do the intake, not a supported employee, but someone who was in training. And so he asked if he could observe. And in that process, I saw him standing in the back of the room, or, with his little clipboard making marks. He asked if he could observe. I said, sure. And when he was done, I said, so just curious, what you got? And so he turned it to me and he showed me, and sure enough, it was a task analysis. And he was recording whether or not she had done the steps correctly. It was interesting in their process. She had all pluses, which I was pretty sure she had. I'm a frequent flyer there. And I said, so what happens if someone gets a minus? And he said, well, we have a protocol where that then throws them into a whole other level of more intense training on that particular step. And it means that it's going to continue their interns, not their intern status, but their job training status for a longer period of time. So it's not just our tool. So closing thoughts. No one's had a chance to even utter a question. Thoughts. Biggest takeaway. Are you there, Corbin?
Yep, it looks like we've got a few people that are typing, so we'll just give them a second.
Okay.
Post their question.
Okay. Yeah, Maurice talked about Michael seeming like he enjoyed it. He totally it appeared that he was enjoying it a great deal, smiling. I was noticing as I was watching the video that he was kind of leaning in. In other words, he'd gotten used to me giving him information, and there were times when he would be doing a step, and it appeared to me that he was kind of angling up, like, is she going to tell me? And in that a couple of those occasions, I didn't, because of what I could see was he was getting it. Yes, Amy, that it is first, then scheduler. Yes, so another way of using that form that some people, I'll just go back to it, well, I think I'm getting the question, is that I record, my recording is either plus or minus. And over the years, that served me well. It's not unusual and it's not wrong if people choose to record with, instead of a minus, they might have a V or a P or a M, meaning the person needed help and I gave a verbal prompt. The person needed help and I modeled how to do it. So you could switch the minuses and use a code, a key, to record needing some form of help. You could also use numbers, where some people say, well, if they totally got it on their own, they got a 5. If I needed to give a little bit of help, they gave a 4. You could do it in that way. That wouldn't be wrong. My preference over the years is, number one, if I'm trying to record the letters, what if I give a little physical assist, say something, and show at the same time? I've got to put all those little letters in. And the other thing is that out in the field, I mean, I really want my data to be useful for me, but not overwhelming. In a research facility, oftentimes they would go back and they would have the time to analyze and look at levels of prompts, and let's change that next time. I'm changing my level of prompt in the moment as I'm teaching. And so for me, it's the cost return on investment. I see the plus minus being a low investment of time with a pretty good return on information. Yeah. Corman's going to put the slides up as a PDF of the slides, and also the different forms. That blank is in a format that if you want to add information or color code it or do something that's be more interesting for you, you're certainly welcome to do that. Yes, Trista, totally. I've been in settings where employers have been either concerned about, is the person getting it, or I'm concerned about their speed, or maybe I'm concerned about their safety. They don't have to understand everything behind a task analysis, but that can be a document that you can share with folks to say, actually, here's this person safely. I've shown this over a period of time. I've documented it. Here's the speed that they're working at. So it really is useful. Also with DVR counselors or case managers who might be questioning someone's progress, or to a family member that, has questions about independence, or for an individual. And in some cases, I've had people say, well, I can't use this form with my learner because they don't read. And I say, well, actually, it's a tool for you, and it's a tool for sharing data. If learners are interested in the form, one of the things, even if they can't read, most people understand a line going up is good. So, yeah. Skills assessment. So, yes. But to use it for skills assessment, I guess my caution would be that make sure that it is a functional skill, something that's as of use and value, and understanding that this is a snapshot of where this person is today and not an indication of where they might be. The Historically in the past, people were run through all kinds of assessments and inventories, and oftentimes that became the predictor of whether they were ready for something or whether they had the potential to learn something. So I think that the task analysis can be a great tool in skills in assessment, in the sense of someone might not do well on the first time through on a task, or even the second day through on a task, but it's an opportunity to invest some training time and be able to show, what their progress is, and how, yes, this is where they are today, which is why we had to be so careful of that, our past history of deciding if people were ready or not, skills ready. I mean, one of the questions I ask is, how many of you stepped into any job you've had with every single skill set that you needed? We didn't. We learned some of them on the way.